My name is Jeremiah Emmanuel. I'm a 20-year-old entrepreneur and activist from London. I am joined by the amazing Remy Blumenfeld, a Forbes columnist, business coach, and all-round amazing human being. Today, we will be discussing a question: are you depressed by world events? If you've noticed that you've been unusually angry, depressed, or generally in disagreement with things as they are, Remy says you could be experiencing grief. No one needs to have died for you to be grieving. It could be that you feel an important avenue has become closed off to you, or that something is standing between yourself and your deeply held values. You may be sad, angry, or depressed because of world events. Remy, so you trained as a grief counsellor, and if you were to share the two biggest things you learned within that training, what exactly would it be?
I think the first thing would probably be that when we grieve, it's not just because someone's died, it's because of who we no longer are in the world without that person. So I think often people think that grieving is about missing the other person. And if we have spiritual beliefs, we might believe that that person's gone to a better place. But when we grieve, it's usually because we are no longer the child or the best friend or the wife or husband that we were in the world when that person was there. And so grief has a lot to do with who we are and who we no longer are without that person. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because if you had a best friend, can you think of someone in your life who died, for instance, who you were grieving for a while? Who would that be?
My father was the main person, and I did lose a friend before I lost my dad. So I had already experienced some sort of grief. But after sort of my dad passing away, I would say for the years that followed, it didn't necessarily leave me, and it was still on my chest. And it wasn't until I probably got to the age of 13 that I truly believe that I fully got over the grief and got through it.
Well, in a way, we never get over grief. We just learn to live with it. Because I would say grief is a transference of love. So when someone's alive, we're able to love them. And when they're no longer there, the love we have for them becomes grief. So you'll always love your father or your memory of him or your hopes for the possibility of that relationship. That will always be there. But the feeling of sadness, anger, depression that you had when you immediately lost him will have faded with time. But it's a great example. And, I'm blessed because both my parents are thankfully still living. And it's one of the reasons why I trained as a grief counselor, because I recognized that I was able to empathize with a lot of people in a lot of situations as a human being because I'd experienced what they'd experienced. But I hadn't experienced grief in that way because I'm blessed that I haven't lost anyone really close to me, other than grandparents who it felt at the time was right that they move on because they were so old. I hadn't lost best friends. I hadn't lost parents or siblings. And it was very hard for me to empathize in a way that helped the person who was grieving. When I studied as a grief counselor, I learned that when someone's grieving, the worst thing you can say to them is, I know what you're feeling. Because even if you've lost a mother or father, you actually don't know what that person's feeling.
So how do you feel in terms of being able to help people? You have the skills to counsel and help them, but you haven't necessarily had the same sort of experience in terms of some of their relationships that they may have lost, but being able to still have the skills to help that person and relate to them so much. What do you think goes into that, and why do you think it's really, really effective?
Well, I think the first thing that I learned was a really helpful thing, which is that no one knows what someone else is experiencing when they're grieving. And even if I had lost a mother or a father, I wouldn't necessarily be able to help you any better just because I'd had that loss. Because how you experience grief is very different. And just to go back to your dad dying, because I think it's a great scene setter for what we're here to talk about today, which is that No one really needs to have died for you to be experiencing grief. And a lot of my clients recently have, well, I say recently, in the past couple of years, seem to be sad or depressed or angry, and no one's died. And often it's because of climate change or Brexit or Boris Johnson being elected or Trump being president or something very big in the world which you would think, well, that's not grief. But it is. And it comes to the second thing that I learned as a grief counselor, which is that grief is not reserved for human beings. Of course, you can mourn an animal, but I'm not talking about that. I'm saying grief is about mourning the loss of something that was really important to you. And it could be your youth and vitality. You know, you see sports people or dancers who, when they hit 30, they grieve the opportunity that they've lost through being 20 or 30. And in the case of somebody who loses a parent, it could be losing, as we said, their role in the world as a child or son or daughter. But it also is about beliefs that we feel are no longer possible in the world. You know, if we're a stand for something and the world around us seems to be saying that can't be, whether it's gay equality or whether it's green issues or whether, depending on where we live, you could be grieving the loss of that. So can you see how that might relate, for instance, to the loss of your dad? I don't know how well you knew him as a child.
Yeah, I definitely see the way that it relates to that situation. You know, at the time when you're least expecting it, it can take you by surprise. And compared to when, I don't know, someone might be elderly or in old age and they've lived their entire life, and not saying that you expect it, but you know that there'll be a certain point in their life where they have to move on. But when it's quite unexpected, it can hit hard the most. And as an 8-year-old child, who again had not even lived his whole entire life, when I had heard the news, all of like my dreams and plans and things I wanted to do in the future, I was like, all of that was dragged away from me.
Yeah, and that's the important part, that your relationship with your dad that you hoped to have as a son was no longer possible. You could no longer be a son to a father. With your father gone, you could no longer be a son to a father in the way that you may have imagined or hoped or dreamed. So your future possibility was taken away, and that may be part of what you were mourning, the experiences that you wouldn't have in the future with that person, the person who you wouldn't become with that person, the relationship you wouldn't have. So it sounds maybe a bit callous to say you weren't mourning him, because of course he had a huge part to play in what you were grieving, but a large part of what you were grieving was the possibility of who you would never be with him as a son. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about world events, because people say, well, how could you be grieving the environment or the change in the planet? Well, if you believe powerfully in the possibility of our Earth surviving millennia into the future, and you see that being threatened by things that are going on, it can make you sad, it can make you angry, and it can make you feel depressed in exactly the same way that we are when we grieve.
I think we can say the same for a number of different issues across the world, and that's why I would say we've seen the emergence of amazing activists and campaigners, and it takes that one person to really be affected by an issue in another part of the world to really say, look, I'm going to stand up and battle against this and work towards a solution. And that inspired me growing up. You know, there were many different issues that I was affected by as a young person. There were other issues that didn't necessarily affect me, but it affected the world around me. So I think there's also that sense of grief. I feel another sense of grief, which isn't necessarily as deep as the others, is the example of how, I don't know, Arsenal haven't won the league in years. And I've had enough because they're my favourite team and they're just not even winning the Premier League. And It's a different type of grief.
I'm not sure that is grief.
It's a different type of grief. However, it hurts my heart till this day.
I get that it hurts you. Maybe it'll be helpful to go through what the symptoms of grief are, because I think once you understand what the symptoms of grief are, then you can see whether it applies to your situation.
Yeah.
Because there was this woman called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and she was the first person who actually studied grief and analyzed it in this way. And there are 5 stages, and they don't necessarily come in any particular order. But if you're experiencing 4 or more, I would say probably all 5, in any order, then it probably is grief. And the first one is denial. So denial is part of the grieving process, and it helps us survive the loss. The world becomes meaningless and overwhelming, and life makes no sense. We're in a state of numbness, a state of shock. Do you recognize feeling that any time in the recent past?
Yeah, definitely. I think on a personal level more.
No, of course, it's always personal.
Yeah.
But, well, you feel it personally, but I would say, having known you a while, that you feel that sense of numbness and shock, where the world is meaningless and life makes no sense. You felt that around the loss of young people through knife crime in recent months. So it doesn't mean you're necessarily grieving yet, because that's only one symptom. But that sense of numbness and shock with it not making any sense is something I recognize in your responses to the news about knife crime, for instance. Would you say that's valid for you?
I would say, as a young person, growing up in London, affected by all of these issues. I grew up in a really deprived area in Brixton, surrounded by many different issues, knife crime being one of them. As young people, at the same time as it having these effects of grief, it also adds, I would say it makes you at the same time desensitized, because it can happen so regularly. You almost feel a sense of being desensitized, and you do have all of these traits that Elizabeth obviously studied. When all of these events happen, imagine waking up in the morning, you switch on the news, you hear that another young person has passed away due to violent crime. Immediately, you do have this shock and anger. You do have this depression. You do have this denial. And it's upsetting. But one thing I have noticed is that I don't feel everyone grieves to an area like knife crime in the same way.
Of course.
Someone who maybe might live in another part of the country and it doesn't affect their communities and it hasn't affected them directly, they may not feel the same way as someone like me or my peers who grew up in Brixton, where it's happening all the time. And I wish everyone did have this sense of grief, because I feel with different issues, when people react in a certain way, it leads to finding solutions. However, it isn't the case in this country.
And it never will be, because human beings respond differently to different things. And you need to actually feel that you have lost something and that it affects you. So people other than you wouldn't have been grieving your dad's death, because their future life with your father wasn't being taken away. It was your future life. So it has to impact you personally. You have to care about it profoundly.
I think there's two different areas. So if something affects you in a personal way, or if it's someone that's close to you who has passed away, definitely someone who doesn't know you would not have an effect in any way, shape or form, because they never had a relationship with the person that you're grieving. However, in terms of world events, I do struggle to understand why with certain issues, many people don't have the same level of sympathy or urgency or the same level of, anger when many of these issues happen. For example, if I share the example of Grenfell, I remember receiving a breaking news alert about 2 a.m. in the morning or 3 a.m. in the morning, around the time it broke out. And I switched on the telly and you saw this tower block that had flames on the side of it. And as you were watching, you imagined that it would now become engulfed by all of the flames. And as the minutes went by, you saw as the flames rose and rose and rose, and you saw as the cladding burned. And I remember at that moment, I was in shock. On a personal level, I was shocked because I had recognized the area, and I realized that a friend from college lived in the area, and me and her had an argument about 2 days before. You know, teenagers, sometimes we fall out. And I remember realizing, oh my, I recognize this tower block from all of the times that we would be on FaceTime when she would be on her balcony. Now, at that moment, I couldn't remember the name of her block. And I began calling her phone, and it kept reaching voicemail. So I was sitting in front of this TV set with uncertainty as to whether or not she was in the tower block. And I felt this sense of guilt, and anger and disbelief, because I didn't know if the young lady actually lived in this tower block. And it wasn't until the morning that I had finally got through to her, and I realized that she lived in a block of flats literally like a minute away from where it happened. And she described, you know, the the smoke sort of in the sky, and the residents having to evacuate. So that was on a personal level. Now, on a world sort of event level, when I saw a situation like that happen, the same sympathy and the same anger and the same, you know, just mood that me and my peers had, that the fact that something like this could happen, I didn't necessarily see that reaction from everyone else. And I was in shock. I didn't understand how an issue could affect our country in this way. But still people didn't feel they had to speak out about it. Now, don't get me wrong. When I went down to Grenfell, you know, Tiny Temple, who I work closely with, had donated loads of items. We took it down there the next day, and I saw togetherness, and I saw different communities come together to help and to assist with the emergency services. And it was brilliant. It was amazing. But a few months ago, you know, when I was listening to the radio and watching the news, I'd heard that a senior politician almost had no regard to some of the residents that were victims within the fire. And again, I didn't understand how that individual did not share the same sense of grief and urgency as myself, if that makes sense.
That's because they weren't personally connected to it. So even in America at the time of the World Trade Center bombing, people in New York felt it more than people in Los Angeles. And there wasn't the race issue there. There wasn't the class issue there. It was simply the fact that people who lived in the shadow of the World Trade Center felt much more a sense of what they had lost because it was so much closer to them. And just as you, because you knew someone who lived right close by, you'd been to that place, you knew people who lived there, felt more connected to it, there are people who lived in other parts of the country who just didn't have that same sense of connection. And what I'd really love people to come away from this conversation with is an understanding that their feelings of sadness, anger, depression are really valid, you know, and they are grief, and they need to be worked through, and they need to be aired. So we talked about denial, and interestingly, you called it desensitization. That's the same thing. What you're experiencing when you're saying I'm desensitized from it is exactly what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross meant all those years ago when she talked about denial being one of the key stages of the grieving process. And I've talked to you about these things, which, you know, strangely, we're in a reverse situation here, because I've talked to you about knife crime, and I feel like I'm more removed from the reality of it in that I don't know anybody who's been stabbed, and I don't live in a part of London. I wasn't raised in a part of London where knife crime was common. And yet I feel more emotionally responsive to it than you. You seem desensitized, and you're talking about it with me as though it's happening far away and not to you. And for me, although it's actually quite far away, I feel, why isn't he sad? Why isn't he angry? Why isn't he depressed? So our responses can be affected by all of these things. Anger is the second stage she identifies in the grieving process, and it's part of healing. And the more you allow yourself to be angry, the more you allow your anger to come out, the more you take a baseball bat and bash the mattress or get your anger and aggression out that way, the more you're helping yourself to heal. The more you suppress your anger and try and pretend it isn't happening, that you're not angry, that you're desensitized, the less you're able to grieve. So my advice to you in your grieving over Grenfell or knife crime is, first of all, recognize that your desensitization is part of the grieving process. It's not that you're not grieving, it's just that you're dealing with it in a way that she identifies as denial. Second is that your anger, wherever it is, you need to find it and bring it out. Scream, shout, hit, because suppressing it isn't good for you.
I think in terms of some of these areas, especially in terms of anger, my best way in overcoming situations like this is to channel that anger into finding solutions. And that for me has helped me within this sort of process whenever I've been affected in this way. And I think it's really important to find different ways to deal with grief.
It is, but you're doing an either or. And the point about grief is it's a package deal. Okay? And interestingly, you preempted her third way of dealing with grief, which is finding solutions, bargaining. What if we do this? How about that? Bargaining is an important part. She calls it bargaining. You call it finding solutions. It's part of the grieving process. Finding ways to navigate through. But you can't just deal with your grieving through one of these ways. So it's no use just hitting the mattress. It's no use just being desensitized. It's no use recognizing that actually you want to find solutions. It comes as a package deal, and we'll just finish them off while we're here. Depression is another part of the grieving process, and I know you felt that too. That you are very positive, and you do find solutions for things, and you are talking about it in your book and on other platforms. However, there have been days when you've just been depressed. And you may not know why, but it's because you're grieving. And when we feel that way, when we feel like we can't get out of bed, when we feel like there's no purpose to life, that is part of the grieving process. It's a normal part of the grieving process. And it feels at the time as though it will never end, but it does. And that time when we're withdrawing from life comes to a close, and we are able to go out and find solutions. And the final one, of course, is acceptance. Just accepting that was how it was, that your dad is gone, that Grenfell has happened, that knife crime is part of our society, not necessarily we don't need to accept that it will be as prevalent, but we need to accept that people have knives and people are violent and people will do things. And so those 5 stages are all part of the grieving process. And if you're feeling any of them, you're likely to feel another one soon. So if you're feeling angry, you're likely to feel depressed. If you're feeling desensitized, you're likely to feel like you're soon going to be going out to try and find solutions. And the important thing to recognize is that just as if someone had died, if you're feeling those things, you need to give each of them space in your life and recognize they're all valid, and that you will work through all of them. Pretending they're not happening or denying them is not good for you. It's not good for your body. It's not good for your soul. It's not good for your being. It's really important to vent the anger, allow the depression its course, and yes, bargain and find solutions as best you can too. But do do all of them?
I do agree with the fact that many people can't necessarily relate to situations because they haven't been affected by it. So you wouldn't necessarily expect them to grieve. But going back to the Grenfell example, for example, Going back to the Grenfell example, when I saw the response to it, I still saw individuals who weren't directly affected, who lived in different parts of the country, who had never lived in a housing estate, still feel like they had a responsibility to help. And when we talk about world events, and if I talk about my world and the things that have happened in my community, I still don't understand why some of these issues are ongoing, but we still don't have like a national reaction to it. And I do understand that certain people would have never lost someone to knife crime. They would have never lost anyone to violent crime. However, a life is a life, and I can't understand how someone could wake up in the morning and see on the news that a 15-year-old was shot or a 16-year-old girl was stabbed to death, and they still don't feel like it's an issue that they need to speak out about.
So it feels like maybe what you're grieving here is something else. And it sounds too simplistic to say you're grieving the fact that people don't grieve these things with you, but it sounds like you're grieving an awareness of a lack of empathy in humanity. So I'll give you a couple of examples. When President Trump was elected, some of my American clients really went into depression and anger and bargaining. How can we get rid of him? And denial. It can't have been true. The vote must have been fixed. All of these feelings they went through when President Trump was elected, because what they were essentially grieving was that somebody who stood in counter opposition to all the values that they held dear had been elected by their fellow countrymen. In other words, someone who they felt didn't respect women, someone who they felt didn't respect equal opportunity, someone who they felt was privileged and entitled and arrogant had been elected. And that stood, so they were grieving the loss of the compatriots that they felt they had had. And what you're talking about is seeing in the general population a lack of the qualities which you had perhaps once believed or hoped everyone possessed around empathy, humanity, bonding, caring. And when you see people not caring about Grenfell or not caring about knife crime, does that make you sad? Does that make you angry?
I would say it just makes me angry. It makes me really, really angry, because in order to take a journey towards solutions, you do need people to, I'm not saying everyone needs to grieve. I'm not saying everyone needs to be affected by these issues, but you do need some of the qualities that are found within grieving in order to create a reaction to these issues.
So what do you do when you're angry? How do you get your anger out? Because you always seem so calm and moderate to me. What does angry Jeremiah look like?
I think anger is such a generic word.
Just
Sometimes
answer my question. What does angry Jeremiah look like? What do you do to express your anger? How do you get it out?
The way that I get out my anger is by just working harder towards things that I believe in. Like I'm not gonna wake up one morning and I'm hitting the wall, or I result in violence to someone else. To me, anger is just using all of this energy within you and put it into, the solution, put it into changing things around you. For example, in terms of me, let me paint a picture for you. By the age of 13, I had known 8 people within my community, either someone who was related to someone I knew, someone who had been a student in my school, or someone who lived in my community. So I had known 8 different people who had lost their lives due to violence. By the age of 18, 19, I had directly lost about 5 people that I would label as my friends. By the age of 20, I had started to see younger people who were not even within my age range, who also came from my community, who had lost their lives. Now, to me, I could turn around and if I wasn't doing all the stuff I was doing, maybe it could result in retaliation. Maybe it could result in me wanting to get payback for the people I had lost. Maybe it could be me resulting in using my anger elsewhere. But instead of resulting to physical anger or resulting to an action that I would deeply regret for the rest of my life, I decided that it was in my best interest to inspire as many young people as I could within my community to turn them away from getting involved with things that they shouldn't. And not saying that everyone I've known has been involved in a gang or they've been involved in criminality. Sometimes it doesn't end that way, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes it could be a random thing that happens. Sometimes it could be the wrong place at the wrong time. However, whenever I heard the news, rather than getting angry or feeling like I have to do something in response, the only response that I can have is to work 10 times harder and to make sure that every single young person in my community can have a figurehead to look up to and can have someone to follow their journey and to follow in their footsteps. And for me, growing up, I didn't necessarily have this all the time. I didn't necessarily have someone to look up to. And I feel that is one of the major reasons for an issue like knife crime occurring, because a lot of young people are fixated in this cycle and they haven't found a way out. So my anger is showing them a way out. And I put all of my anger into this so that I cannot lose a friend again. And that is the way that I use my anger.
Well, maybe 3 observations just to wrap it up, because I know we've been talking about depression and anger and sadness over world events for a while. 3 things. First, in your case, you've lost people who you've known personally. And so that is grief over people, which we understand and accept, because that's how grief is normally applied. It's applied to the loss of a person. And in the case of knife crime, your anger about knife crime as a topic and your grief over people you've lost who were friends and classmates have come together in one area. So it's not just that you're angry that people out there are stabbing each other, you're also deeply affected by the loss of people who were close to you. The second thing is, it seems like you think anger is a bad thing, and I can see why when it's associated with stuff like knife crime. However, anger is just a human emotion, like joy, like sadness, and it's important to get it out. So you used examples of hitting the wall or punching somebody, and I agree those would be unfortunate expressions of anger, both for your hand and for the other person. But you can get anger out in different physical ways, like going into a field and just screaming, or hitting a bale of hay with a stick, or just raging, because it is an emotion. And just like joy, if you said to me, I feel a lot of joy, I'd go, well, where is the joy? And you go, well, I'm expressing my joy through what I do. And I go, but it doesn't sound like there's any joy there. When you talk about anger and your expression of it, I don't feel the anger. I don't sense the anger. There is no anger there. So I think for you personally, it'd be really useful to find ways, whether it's through sport, whether it's through judo, whether it's through hitting a bale of hay, to get your anger out, because anger is an emotion just like any other. It's not good or bad. It's definitely not bad. And finally, I just want to say, probably on behalf of everyone who's listening, thank goodness that you have channeled this way for society, for your community, and for you, because finding a sense of purpose and trying to find solutions is the best way to channel one's energy in any situation, and to be a role model for other young people who may only be feeling the raw anger or the raw pain or the raw sadness or the raw depression. To have someone like you who's channeling all those feelings through action and resolution is a wonderful thing for society I'm only going to ask that for you personally, you look to your own care and personal well-being and find a way to express your anger, which is a normal part of grief.
I believe many different people have ways of grieving. And it was good to hear about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the findings that she found, the 5 different areas. My advice to anyone listening is that if you are in a period of grief, don't keep it to yourself. Look at your loved ones, look at the people around you, and make sure that, you know, you're connecting with people around you so you don't have to handle all of these stresses and areas on your own. And also to recognize that there are different areas in grief and there's nothing wrong with experiencing any of them, whether that's denial, anger, bargaining, depression or acceptance. It's really important to grieve and to work towards getting through the situation. Grieving world events, you know, there are many things that happen all across the world. And similar to like my personal journey, I would just advise anyone that if you are fed up about different things that are happening across the world in terms of world events, then you should use your voice, you should use your platform, create a platform for yourself, use your network and work towards, you know, tackling that issue, whether that could be climate change, whether that could be extreme poverty in a certain part of the world, whether that could be knife crime, which is an issue that affected me. Any sort of world event that you're grieving over, try and channel some of these areas and work towards impacting that issue. Thank you for listening to the Mirror Mentor podcast. My name is Jeremiah. I'm glad you could join us today. Thank you again to my Mirror Mentor, Remy Blumenfeld. And I look forward to all of you hearing the next episode. Thank you.